I really do think that it's important for us to start with the historic moment at the Supreme Court last week, because it literally is the future in the making. By 6-3, the court affirmed LGBTQ employment rights, but within that was something that was even more important, the fact that one of the plaintiffs, Amy Stevens, was the first transgender plaintiff to ever appear before the court, and it was the first major ruling on transgender rights in the history of the United States by the Supreme Court. And that's why I'm thrilled that we are joined by Chase Strangio, who is the Deputy Director of Transgender Justice at ACLU, and more importantly, I guess, or as importantly, the mastermind behind the ruling recently. Amy Stevens was actually Chase's own client. I think you can see right now a video of Chase with Laverne Cox and Sada Ramirez the day of the arguing of the case. Unfortunately, Amy passed last month, right before the ruling, but we are here to talk with Chase, who is booked and busy. You're writing so many articles, and you have an appearance after this in the disclosure conversation. So Chase, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to see you and to be here and to celebrate your work.
Thank you so much. Your work is pivotal. And one of the questions that I have for you is, are you still in shock? Has your body come back? Has your mind come back into your body, or how are you actually feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is incredibly, surprising to sort of integrate what happened with what our expectations were. And I remember you and I spoke just a few days after the argument, and I was not feeling necessarily optimistic about the prospects for the case, and sort of gearing up for the fact that, win or lose, that ultimately it's going to be our mobilization in other contexts that's going to impact how we move forward no matter what. And that is still true. And so I think we still have to hold that, because we're not going to get full justice from the Supreme Court. And this was, an incredible victory, years in the making. And in fact, Amy's case was the first explicitly trans rights case ever decided by the Supreme Court, but she actually wasn't the first trans plaintiff. Dee Farmer, a Black trans woman who was a jailhouse lawyer, was the first trans person to appear before the Supreme Court in a prisoner rights case that was litigated years ago. So I think that there's just so much history that brought us to this moment. And even just the fact that the mobilization for Black trans lives was the day before the decision, really to me speaks to how we got this conservative court to rule for us. Because the law hasn't changed since 1964. What's changed is people's demand and presence in front of conservative people. So, Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion, and the chief who signed it, they're living in a world where trans people are making ourselves known and visible and demanding justice. And so I think that is an important thing to hold, because it wasn't just the legal arguments that we made. And in fact, I think more importantly, it was all of the ways that people showed up.
Yeah. On that point, the idea that win or lose, that we still have to mobilize, one of the questions that I have for you is, what does this ruling mean, and what doesn't it mean for our community? We still have the trans military ban. We still have the exclusion by Betsy DeVos's education department of trans people from civil rights protections in schools. That's still on the books. The healthcare ruling, and of course the movements in 20 states across the country, either through the legislature or through lawsuits, to ban trans rights in some way. So can you tell us what this case means for us and what it doesn't mean?
Yeah, so starting with sort of what it definitely means, unequivocally, it means that LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination in employment across the country. There's really no question. It was a very clear ruling. I also think it unequivocally means, at least from my perspective, and I think most courts would agree, that applies in the context of other federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination. So that includes education, healthcare, housing and shelter, and credit, as well as when the government discriminates in the context of constitutional equal protection violations. So this actually does have sweeping implications for a lot of the areas where the Trump administration has been attacking us. the healthcare rule, for example, which came out the Friday before this decision, it was premised on an interpretation of sex under federal law that the Supreme Court rejected. And as much as the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos and Attorney General Barr would like to believe they're the final word on what these statutory protections mean, they're not. The Supreme Court is, and they have spoken. So I think that when it comes to enforcing the healthcare rule in the way the Trump administration wants to, they absolutely cannot do that. And we are already in court in healthcare cases to enforce that. Same is true as to cases involving education. Now, I think where obviously there's still a lot more legal work to do is in defending the attacks on trans people in the states. So we know that this past legislative session, there were 20 bills targeting trans people in sports using incredibly regressive notions of sex verification that have a deeply anti-Black and misogynist history. Those are being pushed, and we're going to have to fight them. And we're in court in 2 states fighting them right now. The other thing that we're seeing are efforts to criminalize healthcare for trans youth. Those attacks are also going to keep coming, and we're going to have to keep fighting them. And then obviously there's just the inherent limits to the law. You can have formal equality norms, you can have regulations, you can have policy, and at the end of the day, those structures adapt to maintain power for the people who have always had power. So there's just a limit to what this means. You can have employment protections and people still get fired, people still face discrimination. And that's why I think we need to imagine more radical transformation in everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. Can you just tell us something that we may not have known about Amy Stevens? I've heard some recordings of her and the letter that she had written in case the case turned in her favor. And she's incredibly powerful, although, if people would look at her as a person who was older and disabled, wouldn't necessarily get that. And I'm wondering if you can tell us something that the public doesn't know about Amy, and what made you keep fighting for her so long and so vigorously?
I think Amy had such a resolve herself, and she was a funeral director, and so her calling was to comfort people in times of like real deep grief. She was able to sort of have the ability to be present and comforting without centering herself. And I think that really is what you want in a funeral director. That was really her first calling. And then she got fired because she's trans, and she took that into her second calling, which was really to build a movement for trans justice. And not to build it, she knew she wasn't building it, she was joining it and sort of expanding it in her own way as this person who, I think the other thing about her, and I really recommend people look for the piece that her wife Donna wrote, is that she and her wife had this incredibly loving relationship. And Donna had, in Amy's final days, she still didn't know what happened with the Supreme Court case, but she never lost hope. And she urged Donna to keep up the fight. And there was this sort of incredibly compassionate, hopeful energy that she brought that is like the opposite of me. I'm sort of like a frenetic, Northeastern, anxious, completely pessimistic person. And she was such a counterpoint to my energy.
Yeah, I think that her wife wrote that article yesterday, I think. And so that can be found. And lastly, you wrote an article that appeared in the Atlantic today called "The Trans Future I Never Dreamt of." And so I'm wondering if you could tell us what it feels like through your work to actually be creating trans possibilities, to be actually helping to create the future for people.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was so striking for me about being in the courtroom on the day of the argument as a trans person is that, and with all of this privilege that I carry, as a person who's formally educated as a white lawyer, in many ways, like I look like everyone else in the courtroom. And yet I think there was so little sense that I could survive. Like I didn't believe it as a child. And I got gender affirming surgery in law school, and using student loans. And if I hadn't had access to that, I would never have made it up to that point. And so there was this very sort of circular feeling about it, which was the Trump administration is trying to kill us with these regulations to take away our healthcare, which would guarantee that we're never in positions like the position that I had the privilege of being in. And by virtue of the fact that I had access to that care and to mentors and to magical trans people who helped me feel safe inside myself, I was able to then sort of move through life in a way that I might not otherwise have been able to. And so I think my hope is that in the fight, even when we're working within the institutions, which I am inherently doing as a lawyer, it's compromise driven, and I see that. But the hope is that we can create some possibilities for people to gain things that they need to survive and lead and live and thrive. And that to me sort of felt what was really incredible about the juxtaposition of Trump trying to take away our healthcare, trying to say that it's not discrimination to systematically misgender and abuse us, and the Supreme Court to rebuke that in a case that had a lot of trans leadership in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you so much for everything that you have done and dedicated your life to do. There's so much work to be done, but it's undeniable that the world is a better place because of what you're doing and what you have done. And also for taking the time tonight. I know you're going right into the disclosure kind of town hall at 9 o'clock right after this. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And also people can check out a GQ article about you. I'm sure your DMs are going to be really full. Thank you so much, Chase. It's great to see you. And I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Imara. And I really appreciate you. And I just love sharing space with you. And thank you for including me in what you're building for the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is Chase Strangio, who is the Deputy Director of Transgender Justice and a mastermind of the historic legal victory for trans employment rights last week before the Supreme Court of the United States.